please now wave a warm welcome to Chloë of the Midnight Storytellers.
Thank you very much, Alison, and officially, hello and welcome to everybody. I'm so delighted to see you all. Thank you very much for coming to hear this. I will tell you a little bit about the way that I work as we go along, and I know some of you have sat through this already today. The main thing that you need to know about real storytelling is this is not scripted. I don't learn these stories by heart. In fact, often I describe my way of working as verbal jazz. So I'm working with traditional folktales and legends, traditional stories of different kinds. And I retell them in my own way, and it changes according to the audience in front of me, which is why I do like to see your faces, your reactions. Sometimes with a live audience, actually, it gets quite close to stand-up comedy, but on the other hand, I'm not that funny. So I will be sipping my glass of wine tonight. And the other reason I'm loving doing these sessions is I've actually got a small number of performances this summer out in the world, and what with one thing and another, I need the practice. I'm a little bit rusty, but anyway, let us dive straight in with one of my all-time favorite stories from the city of Venice. And it wasn't even particularly long ago, on a grey and muggy morning in the city of Venice. 7 fishermen and their servant boy were making their way through the square near St. Mark's, pushing their way through the pigeons that were flying up in all directions. And they got to the edge of the canal and they climbed down into their battered and very old motorboat, and they wrestled the engine into life, unmoored, and chugged away down the Grand Canal, past the Arsenale and out into the Venice Lagoon. The clouds were low, and the waters of the lagoon heaved slow and steel grey. It was the kind of morning where if you sat still, you felt the cold, but the moment that you moved, you oozed sweat. The fishermen took the motorboat past Murano, the Isle of Glassmakers, and past the Isle of the Dead. They averted their eyes. And as they did every morning, they chugged across to one of the many small islands that are dotted around the Venice Lagoon. And on this particular island was a ruined villa and an overgrown garden that the fishermen had taken over many years before. There was a long wooden jetty, and they steered the boat up to the jetty, and they pushed the servant boy out onto the jetty. I mean, the lad was, I don't know, 10, maybe 12 years old. And they said, boy, we'll be coming in for our lunch at noon, and we want it just right. We want pasta al dente, we want spicy sauce, we want cold wine, and woe betide you if it's not done just the way we like. And the lad cringed and he nodded, and he still had bruises from the days when his masters didn't like the way their servant prepared the lunch. And then the fishermen turned the boat away and went out into the wide open space of the lagoon and began to cast their nets and reel them in, and cast their nets and reel them in, but they were catching nothing. It was as if all the fish in the Venice Lagoon had vanished, and the fishermen were on their way to being in a foul mood. when the man keeping lookout at the prow gave a shout, he'd seen something floating in the water. And not for the first time in the Venice lagoon, the something floating in the water turned out to be a dead body. Once she had been beautiful. She still wore her magnificent gown. She still had jewels, diamonds, emeralds glittering at her ears, around her neck, on her wrists, and on what remained of her fingers. And there were long, dark straggles of hair across her face. The fishermen knew they'd get a reward for taking the poor girl back to the city, back to her family. So they hauled her into the boat. And then, of course, it occurred to them no one needed to know that all those gems hadn't just slithered off her and sunk to the bottom of the lagoon. So they stripped off the jewels and stuffed their pockets full. And then, as the day had warmed up a lot by then, and they really didn't want to have to smell her, they folded her up and shoved her under a seat and put an old tarpaulin over her to cover her up. And soon after that, it was time for lunch. So they steered the boat back to what they thought of as their island and moored up at the end of the wooden jetty. And they climbed out of the boat, and their heavy sea boots thumped and clunked as they marched up towards the garden. And as they went, they thought up a practical joke to play on their servant boy. The lad was standing next to the fire pit, and there were the mattresses and chairs all set out for the fishermen to make themselves comfortable. And the boy was cringing and waiting for them. Masters, it's all ready. It's done just the way you like it. And the fisherman said to him, boy, we've got an extra guest for lunch. We rescued a lady who must have fallen overboard from some ship. But she had such a fright, such a shock, that she's had to have a sleep in our boat, and she's still there. She's still asleep. So, boy, go and wake her up. Go and wake up the lady and bring her to us for lunch. Yes, masters, of course, right away. And as the fishermen settled themselves down around the fire pit and started helping themselves to food and wine, they heard the boy's bare feet pattering away down the jetty. And so then the fishermen tucked in. They ate, and they drank, and they drank, and they drank, and they ate. And all the time they were grinning and nudging each other and listening, waiting for the scream, the shout, the panic from the boy. But nothing happened. And it was only when the fishermen were sitting back, full and sleepy, ready to snooze away the heat of the afternoon, that's when the boy came back. He stood in front of them. He looked down at them. He said, masters, I've done as you asked. I've woken the lady up. She's coming. Now. And the 7 fishermen were so full and so sleepy, they couldn't even move, as from the end of the jetty coming towards them, they heard squelch, 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 wet, heavy footsteps. The boy ran. He ran to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind some bushes. He didn't want to be anywhere near what happened next. He didn't want to see what happened next. But he did hear what happened next. When the screaming stopped and silence descended across that little island, that's when the boy darted out from his hiding place and ran past everything that had happened and down the jetty and jumped into the boat and tugged the engine into life. It caught first time, and he unmoored and cast off and pushed the boat away from the jetty and steered the boat well away from that island. Some people say that as the boat went along, the boys saw something sparkle down in the scuppers, one jewel that had fallen. Some people say the boy took that jewel and didn't bother going back to Venice at all. Some people say the boy went straight to the mainland and made himself a new life. I don't know, it would have been nice. But what I can tell you is that those 7 fishermen of Venice were never seen again. Thank you. Thank you very much. One of the things that storytellers are expected to do, a bit like folk musicians, is always to acknowledge the the provenance of a story. And no one is quite sure where that story comes from. I mean, a lot of my stories that I tell, I've never seen them written down. I've just collected them the way storytellers always have, which is to hear someone else tell it, and then you work on it and you retell it in your own words. And that's the way you avoid accusations of plagiarism, by the way. Instead, we call it the oral tradition. But this story came to me. I was at a storytelling festival 20 odd years ago, and actually you can have enough of hearing stories. So I'd gone off to have a very large quantity of coffee, and I was sitting there, and this man came and sat next to me at the counter, and he said, could he tell me a story? And I thought, well, I suppose he wants to practice. But you know what? He didn't look like your average festival goer. He had on a formal dark blue overcoat. He had on a big red scarf. He didn't look like someone who'd be at a festival at all. But this was the story he told me. And I thanked him, and he got up and he walked away. And I never saw him at that festival for the whole of the rest of the weekend. And nobody else in UK storytelling has ever been able to tell me who he was. So, cheers to him, whoever he was, if he was even real. Now, because we are at this time of night, quite late here, 10 o'clock after, 10:30 in England, I'm doing stories for the night. And this next one is one of the pieces I don't often get a chance to tell. But it is one of my favorites, and it comes from the far, far north of Britain, from the Western Isles of Scotland, from the Isle of Barra. It's absolutely beautiful up there. There are seals, there are birds, particularly cormorants in those waters. And on the rocks around the shores of Barra, there grows a unique seaweed, a long-stranded grey-green seaweed with curly golden edges. And you don't find it anywhere else, and there's a reason for that. And my friend tells me the waters around the Isle of Barra are so clear green, you can see right down to the ocean floor and count the arms on the starfish. And once, in the time when stories were being made, there were 2 sisters who lived on Barra. 2 sisters who shared a croft and shared the hard work of their lives. One sister was fair, a vast shining mane of golden tresses, like sunlight in motion. Her sister was dark, rich, near black hair, coils and curls of it, as dark as a secret, as dark as an unknown fate. There weren't many available young men in that part of the world. And so it happened that both sisters fell in love with the same young man, and he might have been nice enough, but he either couldn't or wouldn't make up his mind which of the sisters he would marry. Dark was desperately, deeply, almost uncontrollably in love with this young man. She would do anything to win him. And so Dark went to see the wise woman of the islands to ask for help. And some of you know as well as I do that you should be very careful what you wish for. Dark told the wise woman what she wanted, what she thought she needed. And the wise woman taught Dark a song that twisted and curled and wrapped itself around you and held you. And Dark learned the song well. A day or so later, both sisters were out on the beach gathering driftwood, one of the few ways they could get enough wood to burn on the fire at home. And they'd been out most of the day, and they both had big bundles of driftwood on their backs, tied up with rope. They'd been to the far end of the beach and they were making their way back, and they had to clamber over the rocks as the tide was on the turn, and they would have to go to the other end of the beach and get up the steep, narrow path to the top of the cliffs. As Fair and Dark got onto the rocks, Fair stopped. She put her bundle down. She said, "I am so tired. Look, there's a lot of seaweed here, but look, there's a bare patch in the middle. Let's just sit down for a few minutes and catch our breath and watch the sunset." Dark looked at her sister and nodded and put her bundle down. And they sat close side by side in that little bare barnacled patch of rock in among the mounds of odorous seaweed. They sat and looked out to the horizon where the huge sun was sinking and sending a blood-red path of ripples across the sea, almost to the sisters' feet. And as they sat there, Dark began to sing. She sang that song she'd been taught. The melody rose and twisted and coiled and wrapped itself around Fair, who settled herself on the rock and went to sleep. Still singing, Dark picked up strands of her sister's shining golden hair and slippery strands of seaweed and began to twist and tie them together, more strands looping over her sister's body, other slithery ropes of seaweed wrapped and tied and knotted around her sister's ankles and her legs, and more seaweed, one final slithering, slimy loop of seaweed tied and knotted around her sister's neck. And then Dark stopped singing and got up and started walking off the rocks towards the end of the beach and the path up the cliffs. And as she went, Fair woke up, and Fair was bound fast to the rocks by the seaweed and by her golden hair, and she could not wriggle, she couldn't move a hand, she couldn't move a foot. She was completely imprisoned on the rocks, and she called after her sister, she screamed after her sister. But Dark kept on walking. Dark went all the way up to the top of the cliffs and had begun to make her way back to the croft, when who should Dark see coming towards her but the young man of her heart's desire. And his face was alight with joy. And Dark went to him and smiled and turned up her face to be kissed. But the young man said, I have heard the most glorious singing from someone down on the beach. That song, that woman's singing has gone to my heart. I must find who she is. And Dark drew breath to tell him, but the young man had pushed past her and he was on his way down that path. And of course, a moment later, he saw Fair struggling out on the rocks. A moment after that, the young man was on his knees beside Fair, plunging his hands into that mess of golden tresses and slithering, slimy seaweed. He was wrenching, he was pulling. Fair was struggling and crying out. And the two of them were still there as the churning grey waters of the incoming tide overwhelmed them both. At the top of the cliff, Dark had watched it all happen. And her heart inside her was trembling. She was beginning to understand what she'd done. But the next moment, in the churning waters over the rocks, the heads of two seals bobbed up in exactly the place where Fair and the young man had been. Two seals who touched noses, two seals who swam and leapt and played, joyous in each other's company, together forever. And then Dark understood. She had lost the two people she loved most in all the world, and her heart broke inside her. As the wind flared out her black cloak and her long dark hair, the young woman stepped to the edge of the cliff and stepped off. As she plunged down, the blackness of her cloak, the dark of her hair, streamed out behind her and changed into feathers. And it was a cormorant that dived neatly into those churning waves and bobbed up a moment later. And it saw the seals and swam after them. And it tried to catch up with them, but the seals were strong and they dived deep and they swam fast. And Dark the cormorant couldn't catch them. How she wanted to reach them, to touch sorry to them, but it was no use. So the cormorant called after them. She wanted to call out sorry, but the only sound that would come from her was a harsh croaking. And so on the Isle of Barra, they say, that is why that seaweed has its curling golden edge. It is called Fair Maiden's Tresses. And they say too on Barra, that is why the cormorant's cry is so harsh and sad. Thank you. I know it's a dark old sad old story, but oh, I love it. I absolutely love that story. And some of you will be noticing, of course, that that my tales, I mean, they're longer than a song, okay? They're longer than 2 or 3 songs, some of them, and I will finish tonight with something a bit epic. But I also happen to know the shortest ghost story in all of England. Actually, just as I'm talking to you, I'm looking at my set list. Those of you who perform, especially you musicians, you know, you write a set list. And the thing I do as a storyteller, quite often I'll write a set list and I'll have worked on those stories, for several days practicing. Oh yeah, all this spontaneity takes a lot of practice. And then I'll go out in front of the audience and I'll just dump the set list because I feel different. They obviously are in a different mood. So, we've got a bit of time. But anyway, the shortest ghost story in all of England goes like this. Once upon a time, there were 2 old men working on a farm in somewhere in the West Country of England, which is about the only accent I can do. And they were hoeing a field of turnips or something like that. And one of them said to the other, "Here," he said, "you know all them stories about ghosts? It's a load of rubbish. Them ghostesses, I don't believe it." And the other man turned and looked at him. "Oh, don't he?" And the man vanished. The end. Now, I've got a difficult choice now. I could do okay, I'm going to try and fit these 2 in. Because this next story, this is the story I hardly ever get to do because it's quite substantial and it's connected to the Cotswolds. It's one of what I call my heart pieces. Not far from where I'm sitting now is a stone circle, not Stonehenge. This is the circle of the Rollright stones near a town called Chipping Norton. It's a tiny little circle. The stones are no taller than I am. A few of them are wider. And there's a small stone circle on one side of the road. And on the other side of the road is a great standing stone that leans at an angle. And there's a long barrow that is much worn down. The story goes that long ago, and far away over the cold North Sea, there was once a king. That king and his armies had conquered all the lands around his own and taken all the treasure, enslaved all the people. And still it wasn't enough. Still the king wanted more. And then somebody told him about England. They told him about the fine farmlands, the beautiful rivers and lakes, and the lazy English people who would do nothing to defend themselves. This king was no fool. He summoned his advisors and he said to them, "Work your magic, find out, make sure how I can be certain to conquer England and take it for my own." So the advisors went off and made their ceremonies. They lit fires. They looked into the swirl of sparks and the coil of the smoke. They went down to the river and they watched the swirl of the current and they looked into the tracks in the sand at the bottom of the water. They came back to the king and they said, Your Majesty, to make sure that you conquer England and take it for your own, if Long Compton you can see, King of England you shall be. You must find your way to the village of Long Compton in the heart and center of the land, and then you will be sure to win. So the king summoned his army, summoned his navy. They crossed the cold North Sea. They landed on the east coast. They began burning and slaughtering and plundering their way inland. And it wasn't long before the villagers of Long Compton heard that this king and his invading army were heading straight for them. And of course, they were terrified. So they held a meeting on the village green, a meeting to decide what to do. And the village elder said, we've got to stand against them. We've got to stop this. And somebody in the crowd said, and what are you going to do? Shake your walking stick at them? And they talked and they talked. And so many of you have been to meetings like this. All the people who had good ideas were talked over by the people who thought they were important and thought they had good ideas. And no one could decide anything until a young farmer spoke up. He said, you're being ridiculous. We cannot stop an army by ourselves. They're professional killers. They've been doing this for years. If we try to take on that king and that army, they'll cut us to pieces. We need help. We need magical help. We got to ask help from, the witch. And everyone twitched when he used that word. They knew exactly who he meant. I mean, call her a witch, call her a wise woman. There was this woman who lived by herself in a cottage at the end of the village. And she, this is the thing, when somebody knows a lot more than the people around them, everyone is that bit more nervous. And in those times, certainly, if you had more knowledge, you were accounted magical. People went to her for cures. She knew herbs. She knew medicinal things. She had a herb garden, the kind of herb garden that if rabbits and pigeons went into it, they either came out wobbling or sometimes not at all. And sometimes when you went past the witch's cottage, and if her window was open, you could hear her singing. And she too had the kind of song that would catch you and stop you and root you to the spot. And you'd end up daydreaming for a long, long time. So they knew who she was and they trusted her with a lot of things, but they were also quite nervous of her. So as one person, the villagers turned to the young farmer and said, that's a good idea. It's your idea. So you go and ask her. And he had to go. And with his heart thumping in his chest, he went up to her cottage and up the garden path and knocked on the door. And he hadn't seen her for years. She'd lived in the village, time out of mind. He hadn't seen her for years. He was expecting some old crone. But when the door creaked open, in the gloom of the hallway, there stood a tall, young-looking woman with long, dark hair, a gown of green and white, and eyes as deep green and still as pools of water in the forest. The farmer nodded to her. If you please, wise lady, the villagers of Long Compton need your help. There's a king, there's an army, they're coming to kill us. The wise woman said, yes, I know. But please, wise lady, we don't know what to do. I mean, please, will you help? And she said, I will help you if you will help me. Well, I don't know any magic and neither does any of the rest of us. What do you expect us to do? It's not difficult. Go back to the villagers and ask them to bring out the best food and drink that they've got. all the best things they've got stored away for the winter, load all of it onto a cart, and you, young man, you will drive that cart with the food and drink to where the enemy is encamped. You will offer them all of that as a feast of welcome. And that will keep them there. That will keep them busy while I prepare what I must do. The farmer was appalled. I can't do that. I mean, they'll kill me soon as look at me if I go anywhere near them. And the wise woman smiled, that deep green, steady smile. She said, they won't hurt you, but you have to hold in your head and your heart everything and everyone you love. The farm, your livestock, your wife and children, everyone you hold dear. Think of them, hold them in your head and your heart, and not the king himself, nor anyone in his army. They won't hurt you at all. The farmer sighed. Oh, all right, I'll do it. Good, said the wise woman. And there's one more thing. Oh, there's always one more thing. What is it? I need you to bring me a bucket of milk, fresh milk that you've milked yourself from your best cow. Do you think you can remember that? Yep, I'm a farmer. Milk I can do. So off the farmer went back to the villages of Long Compton, and you can imagine they were so relieved they had nothing more difficult or dangerous to do than give up some food and drink. And soon the cart was loaded, and soon everyone was patting the young man on the back and helping him into the driving seat and pushing the horse's reins into his hands. And as the sun was setting, he drove that cart up the long, slow hill out of Long Compton. And as the first stars came out, he was looking around. Well, it wasn't hard to find where the enemy was encamped. You just had to look for the glow of fires, and there were dead things along the roadside. And then he came around a corner, and there were two sentries with long spears pointed straight at him. He halted the cart and he put on a smile that he really didn't feel. And he said, evening, lads, I brought a feast of welcome for you and all the brave boys. And the sentries were so astonished, because this was the first person who hadn't run away from them all the way across England. They let him through. And the young farmer drove the cart right on into the enemy encampment. There were tents and cook fires as far as the eye could see. In the middle of it all, there was the king's pavilion, banners flapping. And the king himself came striding out in his chainmail with his big sword at his side. And the young man bowed very politely, Your Majesty, the villagers of Long Compton do send you a feast of welcome so that you and all the brave lads can refresh themselves before you go on your way. The king smiled a slow, cruel smile. This village of Long Compton that was essential to his plans for conquest, they were giving up without even thinking of resisting him. So the king graciously accepted the feast, and the soldiers gathered around the cart and took everything off and broke open the drink, and the quarrels were starting a moment or two later. And in the middle of all of that, the farmer very quietly turned the cart around and drove away. He got clean out. And he was making his way with the wheels turning and grinding and the horses' hooves clip-clopping and owls hooting far away across the valley. and he could almost see the lights of the village. And then something moved at the side of the track, and he thought it was a tree, and then it wasn't a tree, it was the wise woman. She'd wrapped herself up in a big brown cloak. She'd been waiting for him. And he stopped the cart, and she turned her face up to him, pale and calm and smiling. Under the stars and the moon, she said, "You have done well. You have been so very brave. Thank you. There was one other thing I asked you to do. Did you remember?" And the farmer said, "Yep, I got the milk in a bucket under my seat. Here, I'll give it you." And he handed her the bucket of fresh milk. She said, "Good. Now I want you to go back to the village and tell everyone to stop indoors until I've done what needs to be done here." So off he went. But a little further along the track, the young farmer's curiosity itched at him so badly that he couldn't go any further. He turned the cart aside into a field, parked it, and left it there. And he crept back the way he'd come, behind the hedge, to the place where he'd left the wise woman and her bucket of milk. He had to see what she was doing there under the stars and the moon. And what she was doing was walking in a circle in the road and pouring the milk out on the ground in a circle. And as she walked and poured, she sang. Oh, that melody, a rippling, twisting, coiling song of soft notes and long notes and swooping, vaulting notes that stopped that man where he was, rooted him to the ground. And as if in a dream, well, he wasn't sure what he saw really, but there seemed to be sparkles and glitterings in the air of gold and silver and bright emerald, and those sparkles swirled and coalesced into the shapes of very small people, and those very small people wore gowns and robes and cloaks and little crowns, and they shimmered and glittered with magic. With a start of horror, the young farmer realized he was looking at the fairy folk. And in those old days, everyone knew how dangerous they were. You didn't even dare speak their name, and I'm taking a risk now, I know. That's why they call them the little people, the lords and ladies, the fair folk. You didn't speak their name. You had nothing to do with them unless you were someone like the wise woman. And there she was, curtsying to them, speaking with them. She was safe enough to do it. She knew what she was doing. But the young man knew it wasn't even safe to look at those magical people. So he turned away, he closed his eyes, he covered his eyes, and magical sleep overwhelmed him and dropped him, snoring, in the long grass behind that hedge. And he didn't know another thing until he woke up very early the next morning, and he was damp and he was cold and shivering, and he picked himself up, and oh, there was something in his ear. There was a slug in his ear. And he just about got himself together when from down the track there came a sound that nearly stopped his heart. Neighing horses, marching feet, clanking armor, jangling harness, coming up the track towards Long Compton. They hadn't been stopped. The wise woman had done nothing. And that young man took his dagger from his belt, and he was going to push through the hedge and try and stop them all by himself. when suddenly there was a swirl of leaves and dust in the road, and the wise woman was standing there in her brown cloak, in her gown of green and white, with her long, dark hair streaming over her shoulders. She stood absolutely still as the first ranks of the army came marching around the corner, and when they saw her, they stopped, and the men and horses behind them kind of crunched into them. A moment later, the king himself came elbowing through his own men. He marched right up in front of the wise woman and snarled into her face, "Out of my way, woman! I have come to take this land and make it my own." She didn't even blink. She said, "Your Majesty, you have come a long way to meet your destiny. There is something you need to hear. If this land your own you would make, 7 long strides you must take, and if Long Compton you can see, then King of England you shall be." And the king, looking past the woman, saw that 7 of his long strides would indeed take him to the top, to the brow of the hill, from where he could look down into the next valley and that village of Long Compton. So he pushed the wise woman out of his way, and he took the first stride with his spur on his boot heel ringing. And he took a couple more and a couple more out after that. But as he lifted his boot for that 7th stride, the ground underneath him shook and he stumbled. And then the ground shook and rumbled, and right across the king's path in his way heaved up a huge mound of earth. This was the magic worked by the little lords and ladies. This was what they did in return for the wise woman's gifts of milk and song. And the king had been stopped. He'd been blocked. He'd been tricked. There was no way on that. He wasn't going to have the 7th stride. He wasn't going to see the village. And with a roar of rage, the king snatched up his dagger and lunged for the wise woman, but she danced out of his way. Up onto the mound of earth she went, laughing at him. "As Long Compton you cannot see, King of England you never be. Rise up, stick, and rise up, stone, King of England you shall be none." And even as the king ran after her, magic seized a hold of him and rooted him to the spot. His feet wouldn't move, his legs wouldn't move, and 3 heartbeats later, the whole of the king turned to cold, hard stone. The king's bodyguard from the army formed a circle and was rushing forward to protect their king. The wise woman cast more magic over them, and it seized them, and they too were rooted to the spot. Some of them screamed and tried to run. Some of them flung their arms around each other. Some of them fell full length on the ground, and every one of them was transformed into stone. And there they still are in their circle. And on the other side of the track, there stands the king stone, leaning, reaching for what he'll never have. When silence had come back to that windswept hillside, the wise woman seemed to take a long, deep breath. And then she looked straight at where the young farmer was hiding behind the hedge, and she said, "You can come out now. I'm glad you have seen what has happened, because now you can go back to the village and tell everyone." And for one last time, she smiled at him out of those deep green eyes, so green, so still, like pools of water in the forest. And it seemed to the man that she was looking for a particular place as she walked away from him along the hilltop. And there, just at the end of the long barrow, she stood as if her feet were rooting into the ground. And there was a little hum of melody from her mouth as the wise woman, with her brown cloak and her gown of green and white billowing about her, she stretched up and she reached out. And as she did so, all the brown and green and white of her became bark and branches and twigs and fresh green leaves and thousand upon thousand of tiny white flowers. In front of the young man's eyes, the wise woman transformed herself into an elder tree in full blossom. I have been to the Rollright stones many times. It is much harder to find that particular tree. But if you have the chance to visit, and if you can find it, you might want to give your greeting and your thanks, because she will be there to the end of time, guarding the heart of England. Oh, thank you. Have you got the listening energy for one tiny, very different story to finish our session? Yes? I mean, it's not compulsory, but okay. This is very different, and I'll do it as quickly as I can. Because I live near the city of Gloucester. And it was a few Halloweens ago. There was a taxi driver. And on Halloween night, the taxi driver, he was a young man in a very beaten up, rickety old car that he was using for a taxi. You know what they're like. And normally on a party night, he'd expect to make good money, but it was pouring with rain. It was thundering. It was drumming on the taxi roof. The rain was running along the streets. And all the lights were quivering and swimming and shivering as the rain washed over the pavements, and all the lights were changing and shining, and there was nobody about. That young man had driven that taxi around and around the city centre, and he'd gone through the bit where you're not supposed to drive, and there was still, he'd had no fares for a good couple of hours. And his windscreen wipers were squeaking, you know, when they need to be replaced, going and squeaking and going and squeaking. And then suddenly he came around the corner, and there at the side of the road, in the lights of a shop, stood a tall, dark, robed figure beckoning to the taxi. So he pulled over, and to his astonishment, he saw that this person was a nun. I mean, a nun in the full kit. And there are many religious establishments across Gloucestershire. We're known for it. God's in Gloucestershire, it's a saying. So he wasn't so surprised to see a nun. And the nun got into the back seat and gave an address at the far side of the city. It was a fare worth having. And they set off with the rain drumming on the taxi roof, and the windscreen wipers going and squeaking and going and squeaking. and all the lights of traffic lights and shop lights and street lights swirling and shimmering on the wet roads and pavements. As they went along, the nun sitting in the back seat noticed that the young man, the driver, was glancing repeatedly in his rear view mirror at his passenger, driving and looking and driving and looking. Yes, this is England, so we look that way. And the nun said, "Is there something you want to say to me?" And the driver said, I would, oh, no, I can't say it. I wouldn't want to upset you, and I wouldn't want to offend you. The nun said, "My son, when you are as old as I am, and you've been a nun for as long as I have been, there is very little can upset or offend. Say what you want to say." And the young man said, "All right, I'll tell you, it's like this. All my life, I've had this fantasy. All my life, I've wanted to kiss a nun." "Oh, well, there you are. See, I shouldn't have said it." "No, it's all right. I just wasn't expecting that." "It might be possible, but you'd have to be single and you'd have to be a good churchgoer." "Well, yeah." "Very well. I will let you have a kiss, but one kiss only, and no tongues." So the taxi driver pulled to the side of the road, and they both had to get out and run into a shop doorway where there was a clinch, and that clinch lasted. And then it was over. And the taxi driver got back into the driving seat, and then the nun got into the back of the cab again, and off they went. As they were getting near the address that the nun had given, the taxi driver once again was repeatedly looking at his passenger in the rear view mirror. The nun said, "My son, I did tell you you could have only the one kiss." "Yeah, I know, and it was amazing, but now I feel bad because I wasn't honest with you. Look, I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm married with 3 kids, and I only ever goes to church at Christmas and harvest." "Oh, I see." The taxi pulled up at the address, and the nun handed over the fare and was taking the change and said, "Well, as you've been so honest with me, I will tell you the truth too. There are 2 things that you need to know. One is I'm going to a fancy dress party, and my name is Kevin." Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for sitting through this.